Well, last week I was gone. I was in Tuscarora, Pennsylvania, at a retreat for the Lutheran Brethren, and they are derived from Norwegian stock. So that's kind of my ancient heritage. My mother grew up in a church that they all knew about in Brooklyn, New York, and we were right alongside the Delaware River. So I threw a silver dollar across the river and crossed it in a boat, looking like this, and felt just like George Washington. It was beautiful out there, and we had a great time. About 120 men were there Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday, and really enjoy that kind of thing. It's really great to be with men like that and to know that God has men everywhere that He's raising up. Well, what is happening in Texas? Do you know? It's called a heartbeat bill. They passed a bill about a month and a half ago that once a heartbeat is detected in the womb, that abortion is no longer allowed. And, a heartbeat is a pretty good sign that there's a life there. And it has caused a firestorm across the country. Businesses are reacting. Hollywood celebrities are reacting. Alyssa Milano, your favorite protester, held a sign to her pregnant body and said, "My body, my choice." I sure hope that baby sees the light of day. HBO has canceled a series they were going to film in Texas. The Top Chef celebrity has decided to march against it, and the Biden administration is preparing to sue Texas over that law. So you wonder, are we making too much of the Sixth Commandment? Don't we have that one down? Haven't we figured that one out? It's real simple. You shall not murder. Well, what we want to talk about is all the implications of that commandment, and we are in a worldview war. There's a battle for a worldview, and we're seeing it every single day. If you watch the headlines, you will see constant battles about this issue of what constitutes life, why should we care, how should we define it, and who should be affected by it. So we want to look at this, and we're looking at it really in light of the light side, the proactive side of it, and we're looking at it in light of Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 19 and 20. Now choose life so that you and your children may live. We want to move forward on this. So if the scripture is anti-murder, then it means it's what? Pro-life. It's life-affirming. So that's what we've been looking at in the last couple of weeks is really what are we looking at in terms of, okay, I doubt that many of us are thinking or planning a murder. I don't know. I don't know what's in your heart this morning. But that's not the end of it, because the rest of the case law supports us saying, then let's choose life. How do we make life flourish in our world and in our planet? And Jesus, summarized the law. And remember how he summarized the law? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But that was a summary because the Ten Commandments never actually says, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus, when he was saying that phrase, was summarizing what we call the second tablet of the law, which is Commandments 6 through 10. And it starts with, you shall not murder. And then it goes on about adultery and covetousness and stealing and lying. So that whole tablet of the law is what Jesus was summarizing when he said, love your neighbor as yourself. So here's a verse that could be underlined and kept. And you can actually keep the notes that we have on your table. Do you realize that? Jeremiah chapter 22, verse 3. Do justice and righteousness. Remember, this all emanates from the positive, the light side of the sixth commandment. Do justice and righteousness, and deliver from the hand of the oppressor him who has been robbed. And do no wrong or violence to the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow, nor shed innocent blood in this place. That's the proactive side of this. I want to challenge you this morning to be proactive for life. And being proactive means causing something to happen, It's taking responsibility, anticipating something, acting in advance of expected difficulties. Now, I'm really proactive about some things. I'm proactive about supper. I'm planning for that. I'm proactive about some car maintenance. I'm proactive about projects I'm working on. But there are a lot of things I'm not proactive about. I'm not proactive about planning things with my wife, despite what the marriage seminar might be saying. I'm not proactive about certain aspects of my life. And what I'm inviting you to do is to be proactive, to lean into this and not be like red-green. I'm a man, but I can change if I have to, I guess. There's a man being dragged into life through a knothole. We want to be leaning into it. Think about William Wilberforce, who was elected to Congress, to Parliament, in 1784. He had just become a believer. And God put it on his heart that he needed to legislate and work toward the freedom of the African Americans, or not, they weren't Americans, the African slaves, the black man's slavery. And so he became relentless about doing this year after year after year. He would put bills before Parliament, and he met scorn and mockery and derision and defeat. And he used to keep heavy chains under his desk in Parliament, and when he would rise to speak, he would drape the chains over his neck. And people would just roll their eyes and say, what kind of a fool is this? A quarter of the British economy depends on slavery. This is never going to change. Well, it took him 23 years of mockery. But after 23 years, they passed a law in 1807 against all the odds that outlawed the slave trade in the British colonies and in Great Britain. It took him 18 more years to free the slaves that were already in those colonies. So 40 years it took him to accomplish this. And one of the historians said he went to a friend after 40 years after the bill was finally signed, and he said, well, what shall we abolish next? And he died, I think, just 3 months after the final bill was signed. But he was proactive about life. He didn't like what he was doing. And it wasn't easy what he was doing. But he did it anyway. And that's the call to us. Not that we go marching all the time, but there are many things that we can do to be proactive for life. And one of those is to just be awake. So I want to walk through 5 symptoms of a desensitized nation. And perhaps one of these will help us awaken and to recognize where we can speak into this. So there's some blanks you can fill in. The first symptom of a desensitized nation is theological neuropathy. You know what neuropathy is? It's numbness. It's an inability to feel in your fingers or your feet or some other part of your body. It's a degenerative state of the nervous system. So the normal signals are blocked. The normal signals are confused. We're unfeeling. And so that's why we're basing all of this in a biblical worldview, because it awakens our theology. Genesis 1:27. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So that's why we said way back when we started this over a year ago, talking about a biblical worldview, the biblical worldview for me starts with the God of the Bible is. The God of the Bible is. That's my foundation. And I believe I can find answers to every life dilemma in that context. So it's not a simple statement, but it includes all of this content. Here's what was said by Peter Singer, who is an ethicist at Princeton Seminary. He said during the next 30, and this was said over 25 years ago, during the next 35 years, the traditional view of the sanctity of human life will collapse under pressure from scientific, technological, and demographic developments. Only hardcore, know-nothing religious fundamentalists will defend the view that every human life from conception to death is sacrosanct. And this is happening all around us. And here's the trick. Here's the semantic trick that's being played on us. Remember last week we heard a video by Scott Klusendorf, and he talked about how he gave us some weapons to use on this. But here's the latest trick. They're calling it personhood theory. And what that says is, okay, yes, you can prove to me through a sonogram that this is a human being. This looks like a human being. It's got all the parts of a human being. It's male or female like a human being, but it doesn't become a person until birth, or 3 days after birth, or 3 years after birth. You see, they're slicing semantically. They're playing with words that humanity is different than personhood. And that's a very serious argument right now, and that's something that we need to be prepared to combat. Our culture is very unperceptive, and it doesn't know the difference between murder and warfare, or between murder and capital punishment. Now, we don't have time to get into all of that. Our capital punishment system in this country is pretty messed up. But it says very clearly in Scripture in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of a man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. The difference is that what we're talking about in the sixth commandment is a personal vengeance. It's a personal act. It's an individual act to take somebody else's life. That's murder. When we're talking about warfare, there is such a thing as a just war. When we're talking about capital punishment, that is never done by an individual. That's only by the government, by the state. And we can argue about that some other time. But our culture doesn't see the difference between those things. And we need clarity on that. So one of the signs of a desensitized nation is this neuropathy. We fail to make distinctions, sharp distinctions between one thing and another. Our Western culture is on a demographic death march. In the next 40 years, Germany will decline by 25% of its population. It's not replacing its population. The United States is just barely at a replacement ratio in our population. Russia is losing 750,000 people in aggregate per year. So it's gradually shrinking. So over the next 40 years, that's 30 million people it will shrink. Japan will shrink by 33%, fully 1/3 of the nation's population. It'd be less than that in 40 years. And so a worldview is on display. A worldview is on display in our world, and that is that children give no immediate advantage to our economics. They're a drain on the things that we want, and so therefore they are not wanted the way they've been in past generations. You know something about China's demographic time bomb, that the one-child policy has made it so that now one child is going to have to support 4 aged grandparents. And it is a huge burden on the young generation. And over 100 million Chinese men will not be able to find a bride because the demographic of men to women is so imbalanced because of the social engineering that's being done. So anyway, theological neuropathy. We need to be clear about some definitions of things, the value of human life. Secondly, there's a sentimental dyslexia. Some of you struggle with that. And it's the impairment of the ability to read or to recognize words. Let me just give you some words that are not recognized for their true meaning in our culture. And I just mentioned it. But human and person. You know, making a distinction there. The slicing the distinction between human and person when they are exactly the same thing. We are confused about man and woman. We're confused about the gender issues in our culture. And they've done the same thing. They say, yes, there's biological sex, but there are 57 genders. And you might have boy parts, but you can be a woman in every other respect. Well, we're very confused about that in our culture. We don't recognize and read the proper definitions. Choice is a word that blots out all other options in our culture. And these other words, it's a right, or we don't understand the difference between kill or love, and all these things. We live in a very, very confused culture. AOC is famous for her bloviations. And she said of Governor Abbott in Texas when he signed the law, or the heartbeat law, she says, "I do know that he's not familiar with a menstruating person's body." So now you can't say a pregnant woman, you have to say a pregnant person or a birth-giving person, because it's becoming politically incorrect to use male or female or man or woman. A few years ago, a sparrow broke into the Rotterdam Natural History Museum, and they were setting up for a Guinness World Record domino. Just wait for the story. They had set up 23,000 dominoes for this domino world record, and the sparrow came in and started the chain reaction and knocked down 23,000 dominoes. An exterminator came and shot the sparrow, killed it, and it became a national scandal. And here's what the museum curator said. "This sparrow has moved so many people. This was really the high point of Dutch culture, I say with a wink." He said, "Actually, this was the Netherlands at its smallest," because it excited a furor in the country, and they found out that actually this sparrow was on the endangered species list, and so the guy who shot it came under criminal indictment. Do we live in a confused world or what? You know, this is a failure to be able to read the differences between humans and animals. And so let me just take one more little shot. 83% of pet owners in our culture refer to themselves as mommy or daddy. The proper word is owner. 66 million American families will buy gifts for their pets this Christmas. Now, all I'm saying is enjoy your pets, love your pets, give them proportional attention, be kind to them, that's biblical. Remember, they're a luxury, but they are not a kid substitute. They're not a kid substitute. Well, the third thing about a desensitized nation is media dementia. Do I need to say anything more? It's a deterioration of discernment and concentration. And we will never develop a biblical worldview or even a way to respond to it if all we do is listen to sound bites and editorialized news or gotcha questions. I call it the outrage culture. That's what it does for me. Is that what it does for you? You watch an evening of Tucker Carlson. How do you feel when you go to bed? Man, I'm so mad at these people, you know, or when any other program. But we will never step up to real life. We won't step up to the process that it takes to save a life or to love a person or to value a life unless we go deeper than that and say, what are the real issues here? That's why in some ways I'm glad that all of the crisis pregnancy centers in our country, the Christian ones, operate under the radar. The media doesn't even know they exist. And I'd like to strangle them and show them that they exist, but on the other hand, I don't want to show them because they'll come in and they'll find something to make a big deal out of when loving people, Christian people, salt and light people are simply doing it under the surface. And the media will never see that. They don't understand why we get upset about the use of aborted fetal cell tissue in the research of different things. But they would certainly understand why you can't eat cheese because that's an animal product and it would mess up your vegan ethic. But when we as believers go back to the source of life and say that is a human life as well and it shouldn't be messed with, they blow us off as just those crazy fundamentalists. They also exaggerate the potential of some of their research. Remember, I don't know if you remember, maybe 10 or 12 years ago when the whole fetal cell tissue issue was a big deal. And all over the news, they were basically saying, if you would allow us to do this, then Christopher Reeve would leap out of his wheelchair. And Michael J. Fox would be healed. They were making these kinds of exaggerated promises. Well, it's a media dementia that we need to be very careful about. The fourth is contagious narcissism, which is an excessive love and admiration of oneself. What I'm asking us to do, what I need to do, is to do hard things. And it's a hard thing to feed the hungry. It's a hard thing to fund a crisis pregnancy center year after year after year after year. It's a hard thing to invest in mentoring with urban ventures. It's a hard thing to feed the hungry. It's a hard thing to adopt a child. It's a hard thing to rescue children from the brothels of India and raise them as your own. It's a hard thing to provide long-term care for an aged relative or spouse. It's a hard thing to give generously to the cause of world evangelism. It's a hard thing to render foster care. But the one thing that we need to combat in that is our own innate selfishness, and to recognize that God has called us with our resources to be available to Him. And I'm going to be asking you in the first question as you talk around your tables, what is one way that you're being awakened, that you could be proactive in this regard? Well, the fifth one is this. It's a nationalistic myopia. According to our media, nothing has happened in South America for a couple of years. I mean, nothing. Nothing goes on there, right? Nothing goes on in Central Asia. Nothing goes on in Malaysia or in Africa, because we are so nationalistically myopic. We are so nearsighted that we can't see things that are distant, and we're not looking at the entire world. That's why we need to be involved in missions. That's why we need to hear from missionaries. That's why the local church needs to be the global church and think about the Great Commission. So we're not even touching on things, but we'll just mention them today that are global issues. Euthanasia is a huge issue in Europe. It especially is a huge issue in European countries and in the Netherlands. There's a whole culture that is basically saying you reach a certain point in your life where you basically, it's painful for you to live and it's painful for us to keep you alive, so why don't you do us all a favor? And we will assist you across the threshold. Physician-assisted suicide is something that's openly talked about in our culture. There is still widespread slavery in the world, lots of trafficking, much abuse, and we need to bring as much as we can true justice to our world. Now, where that comes is usually not for us political. For us, it's usually one-on-one, one person at a time. It's one Habitat for Humanity built for one family. It's one mentoring opportunity for us. It's one child that we raise. It's one grandchild that we invest in. It's one mother that we rescue. That's the way we often see it taking place. To be the light, to stay focused, and to make sure that God has His people, and that person is me, in many of those situations. So the living church with a biblical worldview is literally the hope of the world for life. So I want you to talk about these things around your tables this morning, and let's make it as personal as possible, because there have been some point in your life where somebody had a biblical worldview and it got applied to you. So let's talk about that. Let's enhance our understanding. Talk amongst yourselves.